Good morning, everyone. Is that working? Okay. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our, I think this is the fourth now of these breakfast events, so thank you so much for being here. Thrilled to welcome our wonderful panel behind me, led by Russell. So for those of you who haven't been to one of these before, I hope you've had a good chance to meet, network with everyone in the room. If you haven't, there'll be more time after the panel to get to know everyone, to get to chat. We've got about 5 or 6 of our wonderful Century team here as well, so hopefully you can spot them with the Century badges. So yeah, thank you very much for being here. As is often the case, we find ourselves in somewhat uncertain, challenging economic times. It seems to be the case every time we have one of these events, so hopefully Russell and his panel will have some interesting insights on the future of the UK property, real estate market as far as is relevant to everyone in the room. So thank you very much for being here, and over to the panel.
Thank you, Luke, very much indeed. Yes, good morning. I'm Russell Quirk. I'm a property person, I think it's fair to say, having been in estate agency, house building, and chairman of a planning committee and so on in my past. I now run a PR firm, which I guess why Paul has very kindly invited me to come and host this panel of experts that I'll introduce you in a second. But first, a few words about politics. I suppose we have to consider the political implications of the new government on everything that we do, whether it's us as estate agents or mortgage lenders, mortgage brokers, and so on. Obviously, there's an implication in terms of the policy of a new government. A new government that is now 83 days old. Does it seem any longer than that? Seems a little bit longer to me. Anyway, we won't be getting into the kind of ins and outs of the pure politics today. So we'll park the kind of the riots and the early prisoner release and so on to one side. But we will need to talk about, I think, the implications of a new government, this government, on your market, the property market, particularly the London market. How it affects sentiment, appetite, and indeed, in specific terms, overseas investors, which obviously are a very, very important part of what many of you do in terms of the trade that you ply. Now, joking aside, the government has had a little bit of criticism, I think it's fair to say, in their first 83 days. However, my view, and it'll be interesting to see what you think and what the panel think and whether they agree or disagree with me, we are actually in a reasonably okay place from a property market perspective. And I think the reason for that is that the current government has inherited an economy that is in recovery mode, I think it's fair to say. So we've had rampant inflation, increasing interest rates, poor sentiment, negative sentiment, and I think much of that over the last few months has kind of dissipated, particularly now that we've seen, albeit only one, reduction in the Bank of England base rate, with more to come. We'll talk about that a little bit later as well. So it would seem that now that together with inflation being under control, also the fact that we have almost full employment, 96% of people that can be employed are employed. Wage growth is very positive, so wage growth is currently running at +5, +6%. So what I would call the retail economy, how the average man and woman in the street feel, particularly when it comes to borrowing money to buy a property or indeed to invest in their business, it's okay, it's all right. But what we're going to be talking about in a second is perhaps the long-term implications, how we feel about the property market, the economy, and interest rates in the next year or two, because obviously that may well be different. And there's a thing called the budget, of course. On October the 30th, so only about 6 weeks away, we have what I consider to be probably the most important budget of the last 14 or 15 years. Why? Because it's the first Labour budget since 2009, 2010, and it is going to be significant insofar as it's setting out Labour's fiscal plans and how they see the economy and investment in this country, and of course the big spectre of taxation in the coming weeks and months. So without further ado, that is exactly now what we're going to discuss. I'm going to introduce you to the panel. So on your left, Andy Morrison. So Andy is Director of UK Property Development and also the Ozzy Osbourne of Property Development. Why is that, Andy?
Because I'm a failed rock star.
Yes, you're a better singer than I think you give yourself account for.
I might have been in the late 80s.
Yeah. So if we finish early, maybe he'll give us a little song at the end. Then on Andy's left is James Tunbridge. James Tunbridge wears a lot of hats. So James is a former advisor to the likes of George Osborne. He is a barrister in intellectual property specifically, and effectively he and his colleagues run the City of London. And when I say that, I'm not even kidding. James is, well, you are a councilman in the City of London.
That is true, and I was very scared when I heard you introduce Andy as to what you were going to say.
So maybe he'll elaborate a little bit on that a bit later on. And next, Colin Horton, who probably doesn't need any introduction. If you watch Selling Super Houses on Channel 4, you'll know that this chap came, you were a runner-up, I think, in that particular apprentice property type competition. So yes, well, look, we have a TV star in our midst. So Colin, welcome.
Thanks, Matt.
And then last but obviously not least, although he's a journalist, so yes, last and least, is Nigel Lewis, who is the editor of The Negotiator magazine, which is one of the top property publications in Britain, and also, I think it's fair to say, a Daily Mail hack. Am I allowed to say that?
Correct.
Yes, and bike gang member.
I do drive a 750 Scrambler. That is correct.
There you go. So don't upset him, he's actually a professional Hell's Angel. Right, so look, let's kick off. As I've just referenced, the budget, October the 30th. Let's find out from the panel what they think will be in it. I think much of it has already been trailed, the spectre of tax rises and so on. But let's talk specifically, starting with, who should we start with? Let's start with James. What do we think will be in it that is potentially economic and property related? And I guess what would you like to be in it?
Gosh, in some ways, neither is great. I mean, as you say, there's been a lot of training, and I think one of the challenges for this government that clearly wants to raise taxes is that they wrote off raising certain taxes, and even with their desire to do unpopular things, I don't think they're going to ignore those particular promises around things like income tax.
Well, they've talked about those with the broadest shoulders taking the burden.
Yes, but I think they want to hit via things like capital gains tax changes. I'm slightly concerned about what they might do with stamp duty. And I think that basically business taxes are where they're going to try and sell their stall. And they're making choices. And of course, we've all heard about the infamous black hole. Now, there are different views on that. But a lot of the hole, over £6 billion of it, for example, is down to the fact that in their first month, they specifically chose to give higher pay rises in the public sector than was being budgeted for by local government and national government. Now, a lot of local government and national government publicly were saying about a 2% rise, but actually they've been looking at up to 4.5% or so. But 5% and above they had not budgeted for. So a lot of
at least not 22%.
Well, indeed. And so I've got lots more notes, but I won't get into that. But the point is that a lot of this so-called hole actually is a consequence of choices that they're choosing to make, and now they've got to find ways to fund it. So that's my big concern. What would I like? I'd actually like some tax reductions and some tax breaks and some different. Now, I'm slightly scared of this because the one thing that Russell sort of hinted at is that I am a lawyer, and I do get a little bit into your world, but mainly from the tech end, smart buildings and things like that, or the investment with the City of London and helping ensure that London is a popular place to invest. But I have long thought that actually the stamp duty system doesn't really work very well. I think that it creates ceilings and artificial steps, and I think it needs to be reviewed, and in some ways I might be as bold as to say that it would be better to be switched to a sales tax. But I don't see the government doing things like that. But I'd be really interested, and the last piece I will say is that it's not clear how they'll put it into the budget, but of course they said they want to get Britain building, and planning reform and enabling investment is really important. Whether or not they manage to do any of that in the budget, I'm not sure, but I'd love to see something.
Well, that takes us nicely to Andy Morrison here, who is a developer. So you're currently building 2 developments of luxury homes in Hertfordshire.
Yeah.
So what do you think about the budget or the potential contents of the budget, but also what you think the Chancellor should be doing, let's say, for small and medium builders like you to help Britain get building?
Well, being purely selfish, I'd love some great tax relief for us more developers.
Yeah, but you say that with a wry smile, but that would actually encourage more SMEs to build more homes,
Well,
wouldn't it? Which would help
we only
solve
build about 10%, as I understand it, of the homes in the UK. So and it's difficult because we don't have some of the cash reserves that some of the big boys have. So we typically do a deal and then another deal, but then you find yourself up to here. So we're just currently building 2 sites. One's got 14 houses, one's got 8, circa £1.5 million. I won't go into detail about what custom build means because it's our unique way of doing it. It's, I think, bespoke suit to bespoke house. So we think we're going to do very well. So we would like some tax relief. I'm worried about capital gains tax. I'm worried about not income tax rates, but maybe they just play with the levels where it starts and finishes. They keep talking about the broadest shoulders, but as I understand it, 60% of all tax is paid by the top 10% of people. And
So don't send them the wrong message.
Yeah. I mean, you want people to be coming here to invest. If you start increasing all those sort of taxes, you've got a problem. The bottom line is you can't tax your way to growth, and so we should just have to wait and see. What I'm really hoping is that they've been trailing so much bad news that when it actually happens, everyone goes, "Oh, it wasn't as bad as I thought."
You are definitely one of life's optimists, James. Really want to come back.
Well, actually, there's a different issue that it'll be interesting to see how Red Roofs perhaps deals with this, the collapse of ISG. I mean, there's, depending on how you cut it...
This is the construction firm.
Yeah, so they're quite a large construction player, major in the UK construction industry supply chain. Actually, they have a lot of government contracts. More than 2,000 people lost their jobs last week when they collapsed. There's around £1 billion worth of government projects. Now, one of the things in the budget might be that they don't go forward with all of the projects that they said that we're going to go forward with, which will have a different kind of investment consequence. How this government deals with the collapse of that large player and those projects and what the Treasury does and doesn't do in terms of earmarking money, but in particular what I'm worried about is the trickle down, the knock-on effect, the number of suppliers that had deals with ISG that aren't going to get paid.
Yeah.
It could be very painful.
So, Nigel, that brings us also to the question of sentiment, I think. You'd say, well, look, those with the broadest shoulders, they should pay more. But actually, as a signal to consumers, house buyers, business owners, those that want to invest in Britain, we do need to see a budget, don't we, that is more optimistic around this thing that the Labour government keep talking about, which is building wealth and building growth. So,
I like to call it optics. So I think that the Labour government have already trailed what they're going to do here by the broadest shoulders comments prior to the election, which is that I believe the stamp duty for more expensive homes is going to be increased, and there's absolutely clear evidence that is a no-brainer for Rachel Reeves, and I'll be very surprised if it's not in the October 30 budget. The other bit, which is the broad shoulders bit, I think is going to be, which is of interest to portfolio landlords, private landlords, is that the tax that you pay on dividends if you're a company director, which is basically a shorthand way of getting around base. Yes. So a way of getting around paying tax. And I understand that, but it won't be brought up to the same as income tax, but it will be brought up to the same level probably as other taxes. But certainly it will be increased, and that's my view. Reading the runes and also listening to landlords who are very worried about, particularly the latter.
Yeah. And Colin, let's talk about London, because obviously London is where we are, and it's where a lot of the people in the room here focus their activities on. I keep hearing, in fact I was hearing in this room not an hour ago, that actually the London market is pretty fizzy still right now. So there's demand, there's big deals getting done. Do you get a sense that people at the top end of the market are kind of shrugging all this off a little bit?
Yeah, so I'm a valuer by trade, and obviously we're at the very front line of everything. Not always the most popular people.
Are you the people that down-value property deals?
We have done that, yeah. we try and avoid it where we can.
Can you just not?
Yeah, I think a lot of it does actually come down to the valuers and the valuers' confidence in the market. Because if the valuers, if they don't feel the market's actually going to be particularly strong over the next 12 months, then they will look to potentially down-value stuff. So London as a whole, transaction numbers have been really strong for us in terms of what we're seeing, and I can only base it on what I see come through our doors and when we speak to local agents, and there's a couple of valuers in the room as well, and they'll probably say the same. But on the whole, I think the super prime market is generally a market unto its own, and deals will continue to get done. Obviously, there is the huge concern of tax, which is always going to be a massive issue. For me, as probably someone that can't necessarily afford to live right around here, but on some of the outskirts of London, would love to see stamp duty revision come into play. I very much agree with James on it should be an exit tax on entry tax.
Yeah. Well, what about a property tax? Do you think that that's something that Rachel Reeves might consider on an ongoing basis? So rather than charging on, so I'm going to grab your mic, sorry, so I'm aware we're being recorded and it means otherwise that all of this isn't going to come out, sorry. So, I mean, rather than paying, I mean, what is the maximum rate now of stamp duty? I think it's 18%, isn't it? So if you're buying above £1.5 million and it's your secondary home and you're an overseas buyer, I think the rate is 18%, which is absolutely outrageous. It's hardly a signal, is it, to those that aspire for greater things, those that are successful. It's hardly a good signal. So is maybe, apart from maybe, yes, flipping it so that the seller pays, maybe there's an argument that we go back to a kind of almost a continental type of approach, which is a yearly property tax. Would that make sense?
Yeah, I think there would be initial outcry because people like to moan about everything, but I think it's probably the fairest way to do things. And I know I've got two younger sisters who trying to get on a property ladder, and the stamp duty is astronomical. And why should it be obstructive? It's very difficult. You can't it's cash you have to have.
But it's also, the point is, it's disproportionate. You've got first-time buyers currently paying nothing below 400,000, although that's about to end, I think, isn't it? That particular kind of holiday element. But they will, therefore, in the future, I think it's in March, they'll be paying stamp duty above purchase on £300,000. So you've got an element that are paying nothing because they're seen as needing help. The Labour government, of course, have talked a lot, and I'm not going to comment on this, about the fact that they want to be seen to be the party of home ownership. Again, it's not a particularly positive signal if they maintain stamp duty at such a penal level.
Well, I was in France only a couple of days ago, and the interesting thing about that country is that most people fix on very long-term mortgages, and the rates are somewhat in between high and low, and therefore the French government have always said we are a nation of homeowners because we want you to stay a homeowner, and we want you to make it affordable so that the interest rate fluctuations don't go up and down and affect them. And that, I think, probably is the best way forward. And I think, or I suspect, that Labour are looking at something along those lines for first-time buyers, which would be that you have long-term mortgages which are fixed rate for 30 years. And that, why not? That's what I think.
Yeah. So James, I mean, I think the intelligent thing to do then is to reform stamp duty. I think the intelligent thing to do is not to hike tax on the so-called rich, because of course earning over £55,000 a year doesn't generally constitute you as being rich, albeit that's when the higher rate of tax kicks in. So that would seem to be rather an anomaly there. But my question to you can, perhaps without breaching any confidentiality with regards with your tech clients, the signal that the government need to send to big business and investors, in that they are keen for people to invest in Britain by way of wind farms, solar farms, data centres. So forget the politics of whether net zero is achievable or even worthwhile for a second. We can have that debate over wine for a long time. Surely Rachel Reeves on the 30th needs to send a signal that if you're from Qatar, China or wherever, and you've got £1 billion to invest in a data centre in Northampton, for instance, the residential property market approach, the signal by way of taxation, red tape and so on that should be sent to those buyers is that if you're going to come here and invest that kind of money, then it's also, we're going to make it very nice and straightforward for you to buy a £10 million home in Notting Hill, for instance. So the ambitions of the government should also be matched by making the tax regime for the rich a little bit more palatable, shouldn't it?
I mean, interestingly, one of the few things that was in the manifesto, in fact the only thing that was close to being techie, was planning reform for data centres. So very good call. But I don't see them actually looking at it in the broader sense. What do you need around them? I mean, give it a sort of a concrete example. In the 1930s, Henry Ford wanted to build a new factory in Europe, and he was quite keen on doing it here. And the government of the day gave permission for an enormous factory. But not just that, I think 15,000 homes were automatically also granted. And then working with the Ford Motor Company, the whole of Dagenham was basically built. Well, it was a village and turned into what it kind of is today. That joined up thinking that actually, when you've got centres of industry of any sort, that you need housing and so on nearby, sadly doesn't seem to be in the thinking. And I don't therefore see the Labour government doing what you've talked about. And actually, the politics of envy is a big issue, because they play to a different base. And their internal marketing and their internal conversation doesn't. They say they want to be pro-business because actually the people at the top realise that if the wealth creators all disappear, there are no taxes, you can't do anything. But it doesn't play well internally. So I sadly don't think we will see that join up. I was involved in the attempt to build a new studio, the Marlowe film project that was in the news, which would have been an adjunct to Pinewood Studios. It's basically a quarry. Yes, it's in the Greenbelt, but it's a quarry. There's nothing in it. And yet
It's not green.
It's not remotely green. It's toxic. And it was turned down. And actually looking at those kind of things are really important because there are people willing to pay, sometimes overseas money, serious investment, but if it's too much hassle, and our planning system is so goddamn slow and scrollic.
But Rachel Reeves is going to fix all that with 400 new planning officers.
Yeah, apparently.
Could I just briefly be the representative of Trevor Abramson in this room, who is, I think, probably a friend of yours? And
Glentree Estates, everyone know Trevor?
yeah, and obviously Margaret Thatcher's favourite estate agent, I think, fair to say. But his point would be, I'm going to make it for him, his point would be that it doesn't really matter what happens to the sales market in central London, Hampstead and PTL. It doesn't really matter what happens to tax because people who buy homes in London at that level of expense, generally, if they think it's too expensive, will rent instead. And so he always says to me, I love it because whatever happens, I'm picking up the commission wherever it happens around. So that I think is a valid point, which is unlike the general population who don't have that option or don't want that option because they want to own. If you already have 4 homes around the world and you come to prime central London to buy a home, it doesn't really matter if you have to delay that for 5 years while you wait for tax to go. That would be my.
So do you think? Do you think that those that would want to live in prime central London will do so regardless because London's still seen as a trophy destination? So regardless of stamp duty, regardless of tax.
No, I'd agree.
So we're okay regardless of what Rachel Reeves does in 6 weeks' time. I'm not sure I'm quite convinced by that. Is anyone in the room? I mean, does anyone here think, yeah, it's okay? Capital gains tax went up to 60% and stamp duty was put up to 25% on purchases above 2 million. I mean, I'm not suggesting that will happen. We don't think the London market will be affected.
I think prime central London and the hubs where you are going to see prices exceed 10, 20, 30 million, I think they are a market unto their own. I think some of the growth areas in London, for example, your London Fields as an example, that will benefit from obviously tax breaks. And obviously there's a lot of new money coming through these days. There's a lot of creative industries that we need to give tax breaks to the businesses so they can then create these new entrepreneurs and people that then can subsequently afford these properties, but it's a trickle-down effect.
And what about people moving out? So Andy, for instance, runs a business where you capitalise really on those that want to commute 45 minutes into central London from Hertfordshire. I mean, you've seen some real interesting examples of, I mean, should we call it trickle out? I mean, that's probably what it is, isn't it?
100%. I mean, we're about to start doing a big marketing piece and we're trying to get them, our last development, 2 came out of Finchley. They're selling a flat for, I don't know, 700,000-800,000 quid. So 1.1 for a 4-bedroom house with a garden. It wasn't much of a stretch. The most interesting thing you just touched on, entrepreneurs and money. We've been talking to various social media people about looking at things differently, data analytics, advertising, but we don't know who our customer is. If you'd have said to me on the last development, the houses started at 1.1 and went to 1.25, but one of my buyers would be a 24-year-old YouTuber. One of them would be a 26-year-old who's accountant whose dad helped him. Another guy was 27, made all of his money out of Amazon. Brilliant kid, all self-made. And the last guy was a 27-year-old footballer at Luton. The rest of them were in their 30s. I imagine my customers there would be 3rd or 4th house. So it's 4 of them first-time buyers as well, by the way. Just an incredible. So you suddenly think, well, I don't know who my customers are, but we like a combination of people moving out. That's why we've got to target the marketing, but also local people. But there's money around that you just don't realise. And so I'm just hoping, and being biased, our houses are not like a Bellway or a Redrow or those sort of things. They're much more interesting. So there's a lot being built in the area because of people, as they coming out. But what works for us is they'll go and look at all the developments and then come and see ours and go, that's a bit different. It's a bit more expensive, but it's a bit different.
But it's still a buoyant market. 7 figures, albeit not in London, of course you don't get much for £1 million in London anymore.
No.
But you're seeing that there's still demand, and therefore the perception is that things are rosy, things are positive.
Well, it's difficult to say. It looks like there's strong demand, but interestingly, when you talk to agents, some will tell you the market's dead around 5, 6, 700,000 and buoyant over 1 million. Others will tell you the exact reverse. I genuinely don't know.
We're in a state of flux, yeah?
Yeah.
Well, I'm not as expert as these gentlemen on the residential side, but I know quite a lot more about the commercial side of investment. And what's been very interesting, I look back at the last 4 quarters, there were 16 deals the first quarter of this year into the City of London for prime real estate that were over £50 million.
So it's just purchase and sale transactions. Wow.
And I'm much more aware of what's happening in Grade A real estate for offices and stuff. We were talking about this on the way in this morning, that people are often looking for slightly smaller space but much better quality space, and it's quite buoyant, and there's a lot of overseas interest in London.
That's good. And so is that by comparison versus 2023, 2022?
It's up.
It's up.
We're up. Up about 15 billion on potential investments for 2024 over 2023. But here's the part. I think that market is much more concerned about the budget. Because that market is a market of often, well, this one's public. So there's a large Korean company that owns a couple of large office buildings in central London. They're not sure whether they want to keep holding them and whether they will refit them and rent them out again, or whether they want to offload them. And they are very much looking at what happens in the budget.
So you think a lot of those decisions are on hold for the next 6 weeks, so commercially? Talking to Luke earlier, actually, it seems that when it comes to residential transactions, people aren't holding back. So, but I guess
the residential market is different.
Yeah, because maybe it doesn't affect them that much. But commercially, so I guess depending on what happens on October the 30th, literally either the floodgates are going to open in a positive way, or not. It's that pivotal.
I don't know whether it'll definitely be a flood, but it's going to definitely impact a number of things, and in particular because a lot of the large companies that are willing to invest the serious money in brand new buildings or serious upgrading of old office to Grade A office, they can choose global cities. They can choose Singapore, they can choose Dubai, they can choose Paris and Frankfurt, if you believe the Europeans. But those decisions, those multi-million pound, sometimes hundreds of £1 million decisions, are impacted by what the national governments are doing and the mood music. And I don't know whether this government's going to send the right message.
What is the one thing that you would say to Rachel Reeves if you could be by the Speaker's chair on the day of the budget, 12:30 on the 30th of October, as you've been so close and connected to these things, what's the one thing that you would whisper in her ear as she walks up to the dispatch box stand?
The Labour curve.
The Laffer curve. Anyone interested to know what the Laffer curve is? Or the Laffer curve, as I call it?
Yes.
Please explain.
Trickle down.
And the problem with this is that a lot of the mainstream economists and all the ones at the Office of Budget Responsibility hate it and deny it exists.
But it's definitely a thing.
It is a thing. It's been a thing since the 1970s. Essentially, it's named after an economist who said that if you increase taxes initially, you do get more revenue. But there comes a point where we just all feel so squeezed that people put more effort into avoiding the tax or stop working. Take it in a practical example. There was a crisis a year ago with senior surgeons in the NHS caused by the last government's tinkering with pensions. What happened was a lot of those people, as they got towards the end of their careers, would keep working, would keep doing shifts which helped the NHS cope. But they started looking at it and go, you know what, I'm not allowed to put any more money in my pension. I'm not allowed to be paid as I was, so why am I bothering? They came to a point where it's not they weren't getting some money, but it wasn't enough to get them out of bed.
Yeah,
so they just turned down.
It's not incentivisation. Actually, when I think it was Rishi Sunak as Chancellor reduced corporation tax, even though the amount in the pound reduced, the overall tax revenue increased. And of course, famously, Margaret Thatcher did a very similar thing in the early 80s when she reduced taxes, and yes, the take increased. What about you, Andy? I've heard you use the term the Laffer curve, by the way, actually, in the past. So it's it definitely seems to be a thing.
Just think about the long term, not what it looks like, because I think some of the things are done just to show we're bashing the rich.
Ideology.
And then some of them are leaving the country, as we discussed just yesterday.
Yeah, you've got a very interesting graphic about this, actually. This is constructive. This is, I guess, show the stats in terms of those that are sort of kind of deciding that perhaps they want to look at climes elsewhere. This is something that, again, Rachel Reeves should take note of.
So, this is millionaires moving to another country. So 15,000 left China out of a population of, 1.2 billion. But the second in the world was the UK. Half have already gone. They reckon to be 9,500 millionaires leave the country this year.
So we need to get them back.
Correct, yeah, and incentivise. And interestingly, a lot of them are going to the UAE.
Where there's little, if any, tax.
Yeah.
Yeah, go figure.
So it's a worrying time, but I just wish that they'd look at things a bit more sensibly. I have to say, I'm a Tory supporter, but I was very disappointed with some of the decisions made. Corporation tax of 25%, seriously.
So Rachel Reeves has said that she's going to cap corporation tax, she's not going to increase it. Now, of course, there is relief, I think, on businesses that earn under, whatever it is, £50,000 profits per annum, where they pay 19%. So I don't know if the cap means, therefore, that those paying 19% will actually see an increase. Typically kind of ambiguous wording from a politician there. But we should take some confidence, I guess, in the fact that she has ruled out increasing corporation tax from 25%.
I agree,
Yeah.
but it
Doesn't mean she won't raise other things, of course.
the whole tax thing is fascinating. I've got
So it could be
friends.
worse, is what I'm saying.
Yeah. I mean, I've got several friends who. I said, "What do you pay yourself?" It's like 100 grand a year. I said, "Why is that?" I said, "Because up to 100 grand a year, my percentage tax is about 27%. The next 25 it's 60 something. So don't bother.
Expect to
Rather
see
go
her
and play golf."
Expect to see her play around those walls, I think, as we alluded to earlier on. Colin, what would you say to Rachel Reeves as she walked up to the dispatch box?
I would speak as a small business owner. We've got 25 staff, and my God, do they make it difficult to try and grow a business in terms of all the taxation. And I would just say, do you know what, think of the future generations here. Ironically, I reckon half the people that probably bought in your development are probably left-leaning. A lot of the creative guys are quite left-leaning, which is difficult for me because I'm not. But I think just think of the future in terms of people that can be coming through buying and creating wealth. Think of the future wealth creators and the job creators.
Well, SMEs, so small and medium-sized enterprises, employ 16 million people in Britain. So they, perhaps not the ones that she should be squeezing. Nigel, what would you say? Very vocally, I'm sure.
I would urge her to end the complete madness of everyone coming off fixed terms every 3 to 5 years. It doesn't really apply to the market around us here in Mayfair, but in the outer fringes of London, if you're buying a house in Wandsworth or Clapham or whatever, it does affect how you make decisions about moving home, and it is a complete craziness.
Well, you mean the shelf almost?
The shelf, everyone gets...
coming off a 3-year fix at 2%,
Yeah.
and now you're fixing at 5%. But I mean, I want to get onto interest rates in a second.
Yeah.
So this is an interesting kind of bridge to that. How do you fix that problem?
By
Maybe someone in the centre.
Yeah, I'm not a lender. I think that maybe some lenders here, so it'd be good to hear their views on this. But that is just my perception of one of the crazy things about the UK property market is that it creates problems when there are interest rate hikes. Most of the cost of living discussions, particularly the last 6 months, have been around the fact that people are worried about coming off these shelves. Landlords included, a lot of them very, very worried because their costs are going to be higher than their rents.
Yeah.
So that's got to be fixed.
And the majority of people, of course, are on fixed rates, something like 70% of loans. Does that seem about right, Paul? 70% are fixed. I mean, maybe not in your world necessarily, in the mainstream.
Probably in the main market. But I would say, to your point about fixed rates, people generally want to choose the lowest rate. If you offer someone a 10-year fixed rate of 5 and a 2-year fixed rate of 4, they will take the 2-year fixed rate of 4. It's not my market, but that's human nature.
It is.
So you can offer long-term fixed rates,
But they're not going to take them up
but if people don't want them,
because they look unattractive, because no one really can
people
ascertain
want rates. A lot of people.
what a rate's going to be in 5 years'
Their
time.
mortgage payment is their biggest payment by a mile.
Yeah.
And 1% on the interest probably equates to 10% of their earned income.
Yeah.
It extrapolates out to a much higher percentage of their earned income. So people will take the lowest rate.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about. Sorry, yes.
Sorry, I was going to say, just following on from what Paul said, I think if you look at, totally agree with the, to try to get more reductions at the corporates here, but it doesn't matter where you are, if you're in the middle of Mayfair, you're in Hampstead, you're in Hertfordshire, if you're borrowing several £1 million and you borrowed 3 years ago, you probably had an LTV at 65% and you were all in at 3%. Now that 65 is 75% because the property's gone down, and you're all in at 6 or 7. So rates and the affordability metrics have just killed the market. I find, I talk to a lot of the local agents and the valuers, we're at an impasse. Nothing's really, yes, there's
but
the
then
odd
we're hearing it's
deal
busy.
here.
We're hearing it's
Well,
a
can I just
frothy
say
top
another
market.
thing there? 70% of central London is unlevered. Is unlevered. People don't have mortgages. So we're talking about that 30%. In fact, recent buys have been about 90% cash in high-end, super high-end London. I'm talking over 10, 20 million. 90% cash buys. So a lot of people aren't taking.
So
They'll take fund down. A lot of people, people will borrow from us. Short term, they see an asset, they want to buy it, they want to get their ducks lined up, bring money in, restructure.
yeah, so if half of the people affected by what you're talking about, on the basis that only 30% have mortgages, it's actually only 15% of the market. So
in central London,
the mortgage, the lending environment is affecting a vast minority of property owners in this
In the
sector.
national market, it's the opposite. It's 75% have a mortgage.
Yeah.
So, but in central London, because you've got the international market, and also, can I just make one point about this? 9,000 millionaires might be leaving. How many are coming in? I mean, wealth is mobile now. Everyone says that as an excuse for people leaving the country, but a lot of people are coming here as well. We see a lot of people coming here. I was with one of the richest guys in an Asian country last week, and he sees London as his base. He's got family in LA, family in Miami, family in Asia, but London is their base. There's several properties in London. They buy stuff for their kids in London. He's technically a non-dom, but he will still base himself in London.
Yeah.
That's what we need. We need people to be here. They don't have to be here
London is
360.
always going to be London, isn't it? In terms of that
For
kudos, that trophy element. But also it's interesting, you know. Again, I don't want to get too political on the likes of Brexit because that opens up a whole can of worms that we probably don't want to open today. But we had lots of forecasts and prophecies in the run up to Brexit and afterwards that said that everyone was going to flee London. So manufacturers, particularly car manufacturers, financial services businesses, of course, that simply hasn't happened.
It's another Y2K, isn't it? At the moment, we're talking about the budget, we're talking about non-doms.
Yeah.
In 5 years' time, will we remember this chat? It's just another one of those things.
Yeah.
Y2K was going to destroy the world.
And I think there's always a difference between when you ask a millionaire if you're thinking of leaving, they might say yes, but then do they actually leave?
Yeah, they want to come out, they want to make a better noise.
Yeah, interesting.
And then a lot of people are hypocrites who say they believe in London and this and that, and then people like John Corbell, technically, well, they're not technically, he's non-dom.
Or Charlie Mullins that now lives in Spain, but is here all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, of course.
And yet they don't admit that. So
Yeah.
it's a two-way sort of thing.
Let's going to put you on the spot here, Paul, before I ask the panel. Interest rates between now and middle of next year, where do they go, do you think? As a bank-based rate, or there's a difference between bank-based and fixed?
I'm not the person to answer this, but one of our backers is Goldman Sachs, a big US bank. They reckon 3.25% next year.
Next year?
Yeah.
That's a lot of drops
Yeah.
from a base of 5
That's
now.
from Goldman Sachs, that's not from me.
So the wisdom seems to be another quarter point by the end of the year. I guess a lot of that depends on the budget and the effects, because obviously it's sentiment related, I guess, to an extent. But wow, that's quite some reduction during next year. Let's ask the panel. Andy, what's your view? Interest rates? Not where you want them to be, which is probably 0, but what you think they're going to be, given the direction of travel.
So I followed that obviously quite closely. I'm hearing almost definitely a quarter point drop before the end of the year, possibly a second. I'm also hearing 3.5% base rate at some point next year. Obviously the mortgage companies all seem to be competing very, very hard with each other at the moment. Swap rates are going down. It seems very optimistic in terms of where the whole mortgage market's going.
But in the retail space, again, in what I would call the bread and butter market, I mean, the Nationwide have just announced not only have they dropped fixed rates under 4%, but now they'll allow 6 times income for first-time buyers from 4.5 times. I think you reported on that, Nigel. I mean, that's a big message.
Yeah, it's amazing. Unfortunately, it caps out at 750,000, so it's no use to me, not being selfish. Being that quite a few of our recent buyers were first-time buyers, but it might just be a fluke. But I'm feeling a lot of optimism in the market about rates. Just got to watch the space, I guess.
And Colin, I think I'll ask you this. Do we think that, despite the fact we have all this noise in the economy, right, black hole, 22 billion quid, all the stuff that we've referenced, the average person, the average property buyer, even at the top end, really only thinks about affordability and that direction of travel. So, how much is the house? What's it going to cost me? Is my job secure? Am I likely to get a pay rise? So what I call the retail economy. which, as I said in my introduction, is pretty strong. Do you think as long as the next 2 or 3 years, that rate of inflation, the direction of travel of borrowing rates, high employment and wage growth, as long as those things stay ticked, we're in a good place?
100%. I'm from Essex, and if you didn't realise, and the Essex market is flourishing at the moment because it is, like you say, it's the retail investors. It's their only home. I think from a positivity point of view, I think if it's just your standalone residential dwelling, that stuff's going to fly. I think the buy-to-let market will struggle a little bit with potential.
I was going to ask Nigel about that in a second, actually, because he's reported
I'll let you go
the
on.
rental rights. Let's get over the kind of affordability interest rate thing. Because what I'm trying to get to, frankly, is positivity. So there's the sophisticated stuff, the stuff that kind of James advises government on around big picture politics. But the average person in the street is not that close to politics. They're thinking, which way does it look that interest rates, or fixed rates in particular, are going? If they're going down, well, that's a green light to me to go and buy something.
I've got a lot of friends now that are looking to move. They're actually looking to upgrade their house, which
Hertfordshire?
maybe, potentially, maybe.
Sorry. You can't blame him.
And I know myself and my partner, we're looking to upgrade our house, and I'm, for want of a better term, I'm not going to say that term, but we're going hell for leather on investing ourselves. So I think that's all the optimism you need to hear, really. Because there you go.
Nigel, interest rates, where are they going?
Well, I was always told that yes, it is about competition, but it's also about lenders pricing and what they see the future being. And what the mortgage works this morning, 3.4%. So that's clearly where we're going.
What's that fixed deal of what, 2 years?
Yeah, 2 years for BTL.
Yeah.
So that's where we're going, clearly. If you want some positivity, I would probably say this, which is that I've been doing this 20 years now, and I've done it as a hack at the Daily Mail, where I've done headlines I'm not happy about. So
Can you give us an example? Give us an example.
Well, the property market's going to shit and that sort of stuff. That you would do, because people like to read that sort of stuff. But in the more sensible world of trade, property trade journalism, but doing that for 20 years, one thing I have learned is that the property market always does well. Yes, there are some subtleties around whether it's commercial, whether it's BTL, whether it's PCL, and all these different acronyms. But the property market always does well. It's politicians and it's the interest rate which does the damage to the property market. And once those are overcome, property markets flourish. And that just always is true because there is an undersupply of housing. I know that's a terrible cliche. Every TV interview, everyone rolls that out. But it is a truism that there are too few houses being built and there's too little supply. Therefore, the market will always move forward if that continues. If Labour does what it says it will do, and I don't think they're going to, I think 1.5 million is
housing provision.
Extra houses. Well, the number of homes being built in the next 5 years, 1.5 million, is fantasy. And the Tories were almost as punchy about that and didn't deliver it. Labour's being over punchy about it will never deliver that. I can't not see it happen.
Yeah.
I will eat the proverbial hat if it does.
Is anyone here drinking the government Kool-Aid insofar as thinking that they will deliver 300,000 homes a year over the next 5 years? In fact, they've upped it. It's not now 1.5. They're talking about it being 2 million. Anyone here kind of optimistic? Anyone that's kind of
Who's
close
going
to the
to
centre?
fund that?
Well, it's funding,
There's no lenders.
it's planning, which of course is part of the problem, but then of course it's materials and labour, which are also significant issues. I think he's trying to increase
There's
building by about
1.2
50%.
million homes with planning permission that haven't been built.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter. 230,000 houses got planned last year, 270,000 the year before. They're just sitting there. So if people aren't going to build them, you can't make the big developers build them.
There is a discussion about that. Now, I'm not convinced that Rachel Reeves is ready to do this. And I can't say who, but there is a serious conversation about turning around and saying that if you don't start building within, say, 24 months of that planning permission, you will start to receive an annual charge from the government, effectively equivalent to what the local tax would be when the property is built, to the developer that hasn't started building, to encourage them to start. Now, I don't know whether they're going to do that.
And that was wouldn't encouragement be tax relief rather than it being a penalty?
I'm just telling you how the government's talking about the policy. I mean, it's interesting some of the things that you've said, and you were sort of saying that perhaps people think more to the left than to the right, and actually there's really interesting analysis that a lot of the arguments in the 70s and the 80s that when Tony Blair and Gordon Brown came along were believed to be settled on taxation policy left and right and so on, they are being re-argued. Jeremy Corbyn's tenure showed that. There is an entire generation that do not have the lived memory of higher interest rates and some of the economic challenges that people went through that moved us into a consensus by the 1990s that isn't there anymore. Listening to some of the comments from the audience, there's clearly numeracy in this room. There needs to be a longer term recognition that the kind of maths that we teach and so on is one that's great. I've got a kid at school who's a bit too bright because he realises he's never going to use the kind of maths he's being taught. But fundamentally, actually understanding what an interest rate means, what the difference is between locking in for a couple of years and 30 years, a lot of people, it's just, they get it, they look very short term, and that is played upon by politicians for a variety of reasons, but not least because at the end of the day, they need to keep winning votes, and if you really care about the country, that long-term attitude of understanding bigger picture policy and understanding what numbers mean over 30 years on a mortgage, that would really change the market.
Yeah. Okay, so I think we're probably at the end of the panel discussion now, given timings, but would love to kind of hear some opinions and maybe some comments or questions from you. I'll just kind of summarise, I guess, if I may, I think what we've heard over the last kind of 45 minutes or so, which is, yes, we're in a state of flux with regard to the budget. Obviously, we don't know particularly what's going to be in it, but it's been trailed as it being somewhat penal when it comes to those with the broadest shoulders, in other words, those that earn more money than the average. But it does seem that despite that, when it comes to commercial investment and indeed the top end of the UK market, so prime and super prime London, that it's okay regardless. Now, I know that kind of depends exactly the extent to which Rachel Reeves goes on October the 30th. So she has a semblance of understanding of unintended consequences and so on. But I guess even though we are in this uncertain time politically and economically, I guess as Nigel alluded to really, over your 20 years, you've seen that generally the property market is okay. The gentleman here of course spoke about the fact that yes, prices and maybe sentiment, transactions are down in prime and super prime London, but I guess that would also apply to the likes of New York, Washington, Hong Kong, Paris, whatever, to an extent. London will always be London. Interest rates are on their way down. The retail economy, actually in terms of its continuing recovery, is okay. So I think we could be somewhat positive, calm, regardless. Anyone disagree with that?
Do you hands up vote?
Well, yeah, I guess. I mean, yeah, hands up who's going to spring out of the room with optimism and start investing lots of money in residential and commercial property and want Paul to lend them the money to do so.
Going with cautious optimism.
Cautious optimism. Why do you say that?
Because I think there are still a number of risk factors at play, even beyond the budget, just with the wider UK economy and wider world stage. But I think there's still a number of reasons to be cheerful. And as Paul said, we don't really talk about people coming to the UK looking to base themselves here. And while we do talk about the sort of apocalypse of non-doms and things like that, there are a number of countries, I mean the US being the most notable one, that if you have US citizenship and tax residency, it doesn't matter where you owe your money, where it is in the world, it's still getting taxed in the US in some capacity. So it's not, it isn't necessarily the sort of be all and end all that is made out. And certainly for the people who are making big moves in capital in terms of sort of 20, 30 plus million purchases, they sort of split quite neatly into two camps. They're either non-res, non-dom, who are here a few weeks a year, or they're very, very serious about basing their life here. I think that's where markets, in particular top end, seems to split out.
Yeah, but the government, no matter what their political flavour, they do have to send the right message, the right sentiment, particularly, because otherwise it becomes a complete dichotomy. You can't on the one hand say, we want to see investment in data centres, solar farms and wind farms, but also deter the people at the head of those organisations from wanting to be here from a residential perspective. So I think they've got to make sure that they are, you know, yes, more broad-minded. We'll see, I guess. Matthew, can I pick on you? You're a lawyer involved in transactions. Do you get a sense of somewhat positive sentiment in your world?
I think cautious optimism is probably a fair way of putting it. I think a lot of investors are waiting until the budget to see what happens.
Yeah.
I think there is an issue that the government have. It's been recognised in the room which is that whilst on the one hand it wants to make sure it's pro-business, on the other hand it has an internal audience that it has to talk to. How does it deliver to both those things in the budget? And I think one of the dangers is, as someone who sends a kid to private schools, they've already kind of indicated which way they want to go, which is they want to be able to say, look, we're bashing the people with the broadest shoulders, and I'm worried about something coming out of left field in the budget that no one's thought about, no one's talked about, that everyone suddenly realises actually is going to be quite painful.
Whereby there's an unintended consequence.
Yeah.
Yes.
Or even obvious consequence.
Yeah.
But nobody talks about it because no one knows about it.
And where, unfortunately, yes, ideology can reign. So, don't I see a hand up at the back? Yes, sir.
I think the two main issues that I'm concerned about is a wealth tax.
On assets, you mean?
Yeah, on assets. And the second thing, I think they'll bring in maybe another, tax, another band for poll tax.
What, above the 45%?
No, council tax.
Oh, council tax, sorry.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, there's discussion around reforming it, which, look, frankly, does need to be reformed. It's quite a blunt instrument. The trouble is with reform, when governments talk about reform, what they generally mean is a hike, unfortunately. So we'll have to see, won't we? You getting any murmurings or mumblings, James, from your kind of colleagues in the Conservative Party insofar as whether they think a wealth tax is on the cards? I know it wouldn't be Conservative policy. Well, there might be the policy.
I don't think Conservatives think about it. They're very much inwardly looking at what the leadership people are saying, and that has not really.
They're literally in stalemate, aren't they? The Conservative, so-called opposition.
No comment. What I will say is
But we do need an opposition at some point.
There will be. There will be one in November.
He wants to provide the balance here.
No, I did once have a chat with Mr. Osborne, briefly, albeit, but I thought his most interesting comment that he made to me was, because I said, what's it like being Chancellor, what's it like being a senior politician in any party, Labour or Tory or Liberal Democrat? But he said the biggest challenge was that both internally and externally you are trying to manage utterly conflicting desires and needs from different people on both sides of both internally, the Conservative Party in his case, and also externally to NIMBYs and not NIMBYs, all over the UK, whether it's BCO or whatever. So I thought that was really interesting, and I do have some sympathy for all politicians, and I know you don't like me saying this, but I have sympathy for the Labour politicians now because they've gone from being start-up to being corporate.
Yeah.
It's pretty much overnight, and I've got a feeling they don't really know what they're doing quite yet. I always remember going. Oh, well, I remember going to. I was for my sins. I was for my sins a fishing journalist, my first ever job. So trawlers and the like. You've got to start somewhere. And I know trawling to Daily Mails. But I remember going to a Labour conference in the last Labour government that the Blair government got into power. I remember this very junior Labour MP who I vaguely sort of had met before. He said, "I'm in charge of fishing." And I said, "Do you know anything about quotas and catches?" He went, "Nope." And I think that's where we sort of are at the moment with Labour. Give them a year. Give them a year. Come on.
Does sound like about the last 15 housing ministers, unfortunately, as well. So, anything else from anybody else? Questions, comments, opinion before we wrap up? Yes, please.
Just about the affordability thing. So it's a little bit of the wild, wild west out there because it's not just nationwide. I think Atom Bank are also doing up to 6 times income, up to 1.5 mil, not just for first-time buyers and on a 2-year fixed. A lot of the high street lenders are doing up to 5.5 as standard. We're also seeing a lot of lenders' appetite for foreign income for foreign nationals. So I think there's a lot of confidence in the market, and this is up to 95% as well, which blows my mind because it's kind of saying we don't think the property market's going to crash. We think it's going to go up, and we're betting on that, and we're lending on that. So that the cautious optimism is really. Is that going to happen?
But there's a data reality to property crashes in Britain, isn't there? So I've argued on social media many, many times with people that have prophesied a property crash because of Brexit, then COVID, then the Ukraine war, COVID recovery, inflation and so on. I mean, lots and lots of headwinds. And you would imagine that because of the sentiment thing that we talked about, I guess, for the last hour or so, that there's been lots of reasons why the property market should kind of fall out of bed, so to speak, and it simply hasn't. I mean, we've only seen what I would call, apart from PCL, granted, but as the general market, as a kind of general data point, we've only really seen 2 reductions in house prices really since the late 1980s. which is pretty remarkable, which I guess is why lender appetite and ambitious loan to values prevail, right? Because of the reality of, I mean, a property price is ever going to crash 25%, so if you're 75% loan to value covered, you're going to be okay regardless. I mean, a 25% drop, I mean, it kiss goodbye to the economy, right? So it's simply not going to happen. And as the point was made earlier on, there's never enough homes. So there's a population of the UK that increases by 700,000 per annum net, and 200,000 houses built. So I guess in that respect, it's a bit of a no-brainer, isn't it?
Yeah, but 6 months ago we were struggling to get 4.5 times income for most clients, and a lot of lenders pulled out of the 90-95% market. So what has been such a big change, apart from confidence, to allow us to fix such a big risk in such a short space of time? I think that's a bit worrying.
Well, I just hope the government don't step in and try and regulate lending with credit controls. Remember those, Paul?
Well, Russell, what do you think? I actually think that the biggest threat to the residential housing sector in the coming year is what they might do to landlords. Because I think that the point about the ratio that you can get on a loan, particularly for the first time entrance to the market, which aren't necessarily the wonderful people you seem to be dealing with, but other people that are perhaps a bit more modest in their income, it's been a really important part to keep the market moving, keep it turning. Those people that have chosen to invest, often small level landlords, just a few properties, an alternative to the pension, etc. You know, there's a lot of people that are saying, you know what, being a landlord now sucks and it's going to get worse. And
unfortunately, we're going to have to do the Renter Rights Act. We should do that as another breakfast, because I mean, look, that when that goes through Parliament in the next 3 or 4 weeks, that has now had its first reading. Obviously, it'll have to go to thirds, and then also, I guess, look, House of Lords, and then royal assent. So we're a little while away from the Renters' Rights Act, or the Rental Reform Act, as it was being formalised. That's a whole different conversation, I think. My summary, by the way, is that, and if you're a landlord in the room, forgive me for saying this, but landlords always moan about what's happening and what's coming. They don't necessarily then go through and start selling their portfolio like Billio. I think the asset of buy-to-let, the asset of property as an investment, even with those headwinds, even with Angela Rayner turning the screws, it's still a pretty good investment when you take account of capital growth, yield, and so on. That's just my opinion, but I think we'll have to do it.
I think the EPC upgrade may be slightly different.
Yeah, we could talk all day, but then Monique will tell me off. Yes, but she's not. Okay, Paul, anything to say in closing, apart from thank you, and thank you to Central Capital for putting this on, by the way. Thank you to the panel, of course, I think it's been very informative. Paul, any final word from you?
No, that was great, thank you.
Good, wonderful. Ladies and gentlemen, let's network. Thank you very much.